record. All right, are we on? All right, here we are. I'm Mr. Pike, and we are going through By the Great Horn Spoon, one of my absolute favorite books. We are on chapter 7 called The End of the Race. And you'll notice right now I'm not wearing my COVID gear because this is the one chapter I didn't have in there. So this is 3 years after all the other ones. So I'm older and wiser. Chapter 7. Follow along, boys and girls. End of the race. When the Lady Wilma entered the blue bay of Callao, Jack counted 31 sailing ships at anchor. He was disappointed that nowhere to be seen was the high-riding Sea Raven. "She's loaded up with coal and fresh water," snapped Captain Swain. "Loaded up and scattled." Nevertheless, smiles were the order of the day. After months at sea, the gold seekers looked up upon the sunny little town as if it were Paris or London. And they couldn't wait to get ashore. Hardly had the mooring lines been thrown out like bullwhips when men began to leap out to the wharf. "Master Jack, shall we go ashore?" said Praiseworthy. "I'd like that fine," smiled Jack. Jack posted another letter to home, to Boston. The streets thronged with sailors and gold seekers, and in the distance the great Andes rose like painted scenery. The town wasn't a great deal larger than the ship they had just left at the fueling wharf, but it was land, dry land, and Jack had almost forgotten the smell of dust in his nostrils. He breathed it in like perfume. The butler and the boy rode about on mules, and the day had all the excitement of a picnic. Late in the afternoon, Mr. Azariah Jones hailed them in the sunny plaza. "Look here," he beamed. "I bought the last pick and shovel left in the town. Since the California fever started, the shelves are bare, I can tell you. And a washpan thrown in for good measure. They're yours." "Viola," said Monsieur Grant, appearing out of the crowd and dropping a pick and shovel at their feet. "I have got my hands on the last one in town, and a washpan too, my friends." And then he stopped to glare at the Yankee trader, who was already glaring at him. "Gentlemen," smiled Praiseworthy, "I think we can safely say that you have found the last 2 picks and shovels in Callao. They're bound to bring us luck, Master Jack and I." His words of gratitude were interrupted by the clanging of the Lady Wilma's bell, calling the gold seekers back to the ship. "Hurry, boys," shouted Mountain Jim. "The Wild Bull of the Seas would be mighty glad to leave without us." And there was a wild rush for the wharf, but when Jack turned, Praiseworthy was no longer standing beside him. Jack's very hair stood nearly on end. The butler was gone. "Praiseworthy?" The ship's bell rang through the air, but Jack didn't know which way to run. He couldn't leave Praiseworthy behind. Hadn't he heard the ship's bell warning? What had happened to him? "Praiseworthy?" Jack was unable to move, as if anchored to the spot by the pick and the shovel. He had to fight back a welling up of tears. The Lady Wilma would leave without them. And then, from the doorway of a nearby shop, the butler appeared, tall and elegant in his bowler hat and white gloves, and he carried the new pick and shovel over one shoulder and a washpan under an arm and a strange package wrapped in newspaper and string dangling freely from his hand. Jack had never been so happy to see anyone in his life. "Hurry!" he cried desperately. "We're going to get left behind." "Not likely," said Praiseworthy. "I had to stop off and make a small purchase for our good captain himself. Come along, Master Jack." Jack tried not to let Praiseworthy see that he had been close to tears, but he threw the pick and shovel across one shoulder, gathered up the washpan, and together the boy and the butler hurried toward the wharf. One by one, alley cats picked up their trail. Watch your finger on the lens. By the time they had reached the ship, it looked as if every stray cat in Callao was after them. Before the gangway could be raised, at least a dozen assorted cats followed Praiseworthy aboard. And in their stocking caps, the crew was too busy throwing off hawsers and preparing for sea to bother with the invasion of the Peruvian cats. Jack dropped the heavy pick and shovel with a clang and to deck and looked at Praiseworthy's package. A dead rat? He asked. Hardly, replied the butler. Cheese? Not likely. Fresh kidneys? Exactly, said Praiseworthy, raising the package out of reach of the cats. Captain Swain is extraordinarily fond of kidney pie, and I promised to teach the cook an old recipe my great-great-grandfather used to prepare for the Duke of Chisley. But at that moment, Captain Swain was in no temper for kidney pie. The ship had taken on fresh water, but not an ounce of coal. Blast the Sea Raven, he was bellowing. She's filled her bunkers and piled her decks with coal, hills of it, mountains of it, taken every lump to be had in Callao. She's made sure there wasn't a cinder left for us. Once at sea, the Lady Wilma picked up a friendly breeze. Her coal bunkers were empty. If her coal bunkers were empty, she was at least lighter in the water and went skimming along her course. And the Peruvian cats learned to bound out of sight every time the husky boatswain came along, threatening to toss them overboard. In an unguarded moment, a snap of the wind carried off Praiseworthy's bowler hat, and it went tumbling into the sea, filled with water, and sank. Are you making sure your fingers aren't covering the lens? Lift them up a little bit more. There you go. So he lost his hat that he'd been wanting so bad and there it is, Praiseworthy's hat. Praiseworthy was left speechless and hatless. For 3 or 4 days, he was just not quite himself. He missed the hat. He hardly felt like a butler without it, but Jack thought he looked just fine. And a week later, as the heat bore down on deck, Praiseworthy began tying a handkerchief around his head, and Jack liked that even better. You look like a pirate, he smiled. Oh, nonsense, Master Jack, said Praiseworthy. Hoping for a supply of coal, Captain Swain dropped anchor in the Galapagos. But there was nothing to be had except a few cords of stove wood on those barren islands, and there was even less to see except the sharks at bay. And the Lady Wilma pushed on. With the rush for gold, streamers were only just being sent around the Horn to the Pacific, and fueling stops were rare. Weeks later, off the coast of Mexico, a sudden excitement ran along the decks of the gold ship. The Sea Raven had been sighted. She was lumbering through the sea, low in the water, weighted down by her extra tons of coal. They stood in enormous black piles on her weathered decks. "Billy be hanged," shouted Mountain Jim. "We're going to pass her up." And Jack stood on the ratlines, and his heart raced with delight. The Sea Raven looked half sunk in the sea. Her passengers could be seen at the rails, glum and silent, as the Lady Wilma pulled ahead. "By grabs," Captain Swain beamed, doing a little jig on the paddle box. "I guess if there's anything heavier than a ton of bricks, it's a ton of coal." And by the time the brown hills of California appeared off the port side of the Lady Wilma was well into the lead. And meanwhile, the Peruvian cats had Peruvian kittens. "I'll drown 'em every one," sworn the boatswain, but he had to catch them first. They ran for cover wherever he had approached, disappearing within seconds. And they found every hiding place aboard the ship and invented new ones. And Jack tried hard to ignore them, for good luck had taught him a lesson. But in the end, he was putting out the galley scraps every night, and every morsel would be gone in the morning. And Dr. Buckby spent his days fishing with the line tied around his peg leg, and he would drowse or fall asleep in the sun. Hey, we were just talking about fishing. Until a tug roused him. But when his back was turned, the fish would disappear as if in thin air. The wily cats grew fatter. And as San Francisco and the end of their long voyage drew near, The gold seekers began to trim their beards again. They packed and repacked their sea chests, and they scrubbed their clothes, and they hummed, whistled, and sang to the tune, I'm going to California with my watchpole on my knee. Jack's thoughts raced ahead to the gold fields. What would it be like? Would there be grizzly bears and outlaws and wild Indians? Certainly, he told himself. It was an untamed place, wasn't it? What was the use of an untamed place if there weren't wild Indians and outlaws and grizzly bears? We ought to have a gun, he told Praiseworthy. A gun? Why? Well, to protect ourselves. Oh, stuff and nonsense, said the butler. But Jack noticed the other gold seekers busily cleaning sidearms and rifles and sharpening their knives. And he wished he had a gun, a 4-shooter maybe, or even an old army musket with a bayonet. One bright morning with San Francisco not more than a day's run, the bountiful winds died away. And by afternoon, clouds had gathered in the sky, and the headwinds bore down on the gold ships as if to drive her back in her wake. With steam in her boilers, the Sea Raven came steadily on course, and by dusk she had caught up to the Lady Wilma, passing with a wild shout of glee and a victorious blast of her whistle. Boys, said Mountain Jim, it looks like we're done for. Not a bit, said Praiseworthy, on his way to the pilot house. The Lady Wilma was already making a wide tack in the wind. She might be blown hundreds of miles off course, even as far away as the Sandwich Islands. The voyage isn't finished yet, sir, not by a long shot. But even to Jack, with the wind snapping his shirt, it seemed that the Lady Wilma's luck had run out, and Captain Swain would lose command of the new clipper ship building on the way to Boston. Jack dug his hands in his pockets and glanced up at the pilot house. The wild bull of the seas didn't have a lump of coal to fight the headwinds. Do you guys know what headwinds are? Yeah. Those are winds that are coming straight at you. Are those the kind of winds you want if you're sailing? No. You want one behind your sails. But Jack was asleep in his hammock when he aroused by a strange sound. At first, he thought it must be Mr. Azariah Jones snoring in his sleep, or Mountain Jim, or Dr. Buckbee. But they came awake too. A deep throb ran through the ship, and then another. And then a splash of side wheels could be heard, and then another, and another. The gold seekers bounded out of their bunks, some of them in nightcaps, and collected on deck. Sparks were flying from the funnel. Steam had been built up in the boilers. What's the captain burning? Said Mountain Jim, scratching his whiskers. Cats? Hardly, said Praiseworthy above the crash of the side wheels, and he gave Jack a little wink. I think Praiseworthy is up to something again. Yeah. Neither cats nor bricks nor spoiled potatoes. As any stowaway could tell you, gentlemen, we're carrying lumber in our cargo holds. Thousands of feet of it. Lumber enough to build a hotel. And it occurred to Captain Swain to purchase what he needs with the ship's fuel account. And makes a fine shower of sparks, doesn't it? But the race was not yet won, and Jack could sleep no more that night. He pulled on an old coat the frog-voiced boatsman had handed down to him and stood with Praiseworthy on the rail. This would be their last night aboard the ship after all. The paddle wheels twirled faster and faster. The bowsprit came on course like a compass needle. It was you, wasn't it? Jack grinned. Me, Master Jack? You told the captain about the lumber? Oh, he knew it was there. But with all his storming about the bricks in the hold, he hadn't stopped to give the lumber a thought. I merely reminded him, you might say. So what did they decide to use in the ship for fuel, everybody?
Lumber.
The lumber. And in the dark of the morning, the Lady Wilma had managed to gain on the Sea Raven, and the gold ships thrashed bowsprit to bowsprit, and the red glow of their smokestacks lit up the surrounding sea. More lumber! Shouted Captain Swain into his voice tube. I want every ounce of steam that boiler will hold, and then some. The Sea Raven, too, was making a final sprint, and by noon the Golden Gate stood ahead of them. But the extra burden of her mountain of deck on coals was too much for the Sea Raven. Beat by beat of her side wheels, the Lady Wilma pulled slowly ahead. Wood sparks showered from her funnel. She entered the sparkling narrows of the Golden Gate and finally came out into San Francisco Bay. The city stretched out across the sand dunes like something that had sprung up the night before. There seemed to be more ships in the harbor than houses on the shore. "Let go the anchor!" Captain Swain shouted from the pilot house window. A moment later, the anchor chain went rattling into the bay, and hats were flying into the air. Beaver hats and straw hats and even a cat or two. Praiseworthy and Jack gathered up their picks and shovels and wash pans and carpet bags and looked to the golden hills of San Francisco. The houses looked like packing boxes with roofs, and tents of every description were pitched along the dunes. "Gentlemen," said Praiseworthy, tugging on his white gloves, "I believe we've won the race." After 15,000 miles of voyage, 5 months at sea, the gold seekers had finally arrived.